Barack Obama was recently interviewed by CNN, and he offered his thoughts on Donald Trump's federal indictment, the authoritarian streak in the Republican Party, and what he perceives to be an intolerant faction of the political left. Intrigued? Then click that like and subscribe, and enjoy the video. So like him or not, Barack Obama is the closest thing that the modern Democratic Party has to royalty. He was an enormously popular president. He retained his popularity after he left office, and he's one of the reasons that we won in 2020 and the November 2022 midterms were nowhere near as brutal as many people suspected they would be, because he went out and stumped for Democrats in various races in various states. He leveraged his personal clout, his charisma, his popularity. And for the most part, he's actually stayed out of the political spotlight since leaving office in January 2017. As a matter of fact, one of the personal criticisms I have of President Obama is the fact that he didn't speak up more often when Donald Trump was in the White House. Now, if you ask him about it, he would say he didn't think it was his place. He was trying to do what many of his predecessors did before him, including President Bush, which was basically give the new guy some slack, give him some space to succeed or fail, and then criticize him later. Now, my personal opinion is Donald Trump was such a departure from the norms and he was such an overtly fascistic and authoritarian president, then that merited deviation of the norms. President Obama, President Bush, President Clinton, so many others should have been much more outspoken against Donald Trump during his time in office. That said, President Obama occasionally does some really good interviews. He did with Trevor Noah on The Daily Show, I think during the midterm cycle last year. It was really, really good. And then he sat down for an interview with CNN Christian Amanpour, and it was a really good discussion. And I want to play a particular clip here because in this discussion, in this particular clip, he hits on several things. He criticizes, or he offers his thoughts on Donald Trump's indictment. He offers a criticism of the authoritarian streak in the GOP, but he also offers some criticism that he's offered before about what he perceives to be an intolerant section of the political left and in the Democratic Party. So we'll play the clip and go from there.
This morning, former President Barack Obama is set to speak about global democracy in Athens, Greece, the birthplace of democracy. Earlier today, CNN's Christian Amanpour sat down with the former president for a wide-ranging exclusive interview. They had a candid discussion on the war in Ukraine, the 2024 presidential election, and democracy at large.
Our existing democratic institutions are creaky, and we're going to have to reform them.
So let's ask about the creaky or not institutions in the United States.
Yeah.
The spectacle of a former president being federally indicted. Mm-hmm. How is the rest of the world, the democratic world, maybe even the non-democratic world, meant to interpret that indictment and indeed the fact that a federal indictee is able to run for the highest office in the land, maybe even the world?
It's less than ideal, right? But the fact that we have a former president who is having to answer to charges brought by prosecutors does uphold the basic notion that nobody's above the law. And the allegations will now be sorted out through a court process. And I think I'm more concerned.
So I'll just jump in right there. So this is Christian Amanpour's question is really, really interesting because it's twofold. It's okay, you're about to speak in Greece, which is the birthplace of democracy, right? Ancient Greece was. And it makes you wonder, what are other countries, other democracies, other republics going to say about the fact that not only is a former head of state being indicted on these, frankly, humiliating charges, I mean, truly serious to be sure, but if you read the transcripts of the Trump indictment as we did, some of the quotes, I mean, it's profoundly embarrassing that this malignant narcissist was so shamelessly violating federal law by waving around national defense information. Like this, Donald Trump is not the Machiavellian criminal mastermind that we're used to seeing in movies. He's just this malignantly narcissistic doofus, and he's being charged for crimes where he threatened national security, but in that capacity as a malignantly narcissistic doofus. What do they think about that? Well, yeah, that's really embarrassing. Obviously it's extremely embarrassing. It's a black mark in some respects on the history of the United States. But the actual problem is the fact that a former head of state did it, right? The problem is not that he is being potentially held accountable by rule of law, as President Obama points out here, that he didn't come out and say this, but people should actually be inspired by the fact that if credible allegations can be made against a person who was once the most powerful person in the world, that should be a good sign. That should be a good sign that even former or future heads of state will not be above the law and not be treated favorably. But the other point is that I don't think we spend nearly enough attention on. What does it say about the fact that a person who is being charged or federally indicted on these serious allegations and may be guilty of them, may be convicted of them, the fact that he still has legal recourse to run and potentially win the presidency? You know, even if Donald Trump, if I understand it correctly, even if Jack Smith convicts Donald Trump of these crimes successfully or gets a conviction from a jury of these crimes, they don't necessarily bar Donald Trump from office. I don't think a violation necessarily of the Espionage Act, particularly the charges, which is willful retention of national defense information. I think he'd have to be charged with like sedition or treason in order to be barred from public office. What does it say to other countries that in our system, that's such a glaring loophole? You can be charged and credibly charged and convicted of those sorts of serious federal crimes and still technically run the country? That's really weird. And unfortunately, President Obama doesn't address that part, but I would love for somebody of his stature to do just that, because I think that's a pretty glaring weakness in our civic system. And presumably it's because the founding fathers, for all their flawed wisdom, probably assumed that the American electorate would never put somebody like that in office. But that's why every system is not bad faith proof. There is no such thing as a system which you can bad faith proof. This stuff has to be codified. We can't just assume that the American people won't be enthralled by some sort of cultist. We probably have to put it down that if you are credibly, you know, maybe even not credibly alleged, right? Maybe there has to be a conviction of sorts, because I could see room for abuse where if you want to preempt a potential political candidate's career, you would try to charge him with federal crimes. Let's just assume that that's not enough. If you are convicted of the sort of felonies that Donald Trump has been charged with, the willful retention of national defense information, then you probably shouldn't be eligible to run for public office, particularly the presidency. But anyway, let's continue on with what President Obama has to say.
When it comes to the United States, with the fact that not just one particular individual is being accused of undermining existing laws, but that more broadly we've seen, whether it's through the gerrymandering of districts, whether it's trying to silence critics through changes in legislative process, whether it's attempts to intimidate the press, a strand of anti-democratic sentiment that we've seen in the United States. It's something that is right now most prominent in the Republican Party. But
so before he gets to this last part, which many people might find incendiary, I think what he says here is not particularly controversial. But if anything, I got to give him kudos, because President Obama, a lot of far-right Republicans like to pretend that President Obama was this divisive figure, but the truth is he was always this extremely stoic, calm man. I mean, he was not given to histrionics. He was not given to insults. He was extraordinarily, perhaps even to a fault, even-tempered. So for him to even just gently but flat out explicitly say that there is an anti-democratic strain in the Republican Party and offer examples, to basically be that direct and explicit, that's long overdue, man. People should have, President Obama, President Clinton, President Bush, who was a Republican, everybody needs to be saying that. This is long overdue. It's so sad that our sense of civility politics, particularly on the left, particularly with Democrats, right? Democrats are held to an infinitely higher standard of civility politics, where if we said half the stuff that Republicans say about Democrats or blue states or blue districts or progressives or New York City or California, whatever it is, half the insulting things that they say, I mean, we'd be tarred and feathered. This was long overdue. President Obama is correct to point out that this is a particular problem within the Republican Party. And I wish he'd just stop there. But he feels the need to kind of couch this a bit, so we're going to hear the rest of it and then we'll unpack it.
But I don't think it's something that is unique to one party. I think there is a less tolerance for ideas that don't suit us. And it's sort of the habits of a free and open exchange of ideas, and the idea that we all agree to the rules of the game, and even if the outcomes aren't always the ones we like, we still abide by those rules. I think that's weakened since I left office, and we're going to need to strengthen them again.
So here's my beef with this. To me, that's the unfortunate side, I think, of President Obama's disposition, again, to be even-tempered and gentle and, generous to a fault with suspension of disbelief and credibility. The fact of the matter is, this is not a both sides issue. And I've talked about this again and again and again on videos on this channel, in debates I've had with other people on other channels, Destiny, Wick TV, conversations I've had with my frequent collaborator Luke Beasley, my other frequent collaborator Staxiums. Let me be clear. As President Obama himself would say, I just kind of slipped into that. No, let me be clear. The Democratic Party is not perfect. Sure. There are Democrats that I wouldn't trust with absolute power, right? There's, what do they say? Absolute power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely, right? The sort of principle we saw demonstrated by President Washington when he was commander-in-chief of the Continental Army, and then again after he resigned without requirement, because it wasn't federally required at the time, after 2 terms. That sort of Cincinnatus principle where you willingly give up power. It's extremely rare, I think, with statespeople on any side of the aisle, Republican or Democrat, conservative or progressive. I think power is very attractive to politicians and figures on all sides of the aisle. There's no question about that. And so the Democratic Party is not above criticism. It's not beyond reproach. And certainly if you go to particularly online spaces, if you go to Twitter, you will find people who are nominally of the left or claim to be of the left and probably are of the left, say awful things or espouse terrible ideas. But this idea that the Democratic Party has some sort of anti-democratic strain to it's ridiculous, right? So some of the proposals that I hear people talk about is, Democrats want to abolish the Electoral College. Yeah, and that would actually increase democracy, right? Because right now the Electoral College is an indirect vote. It's not popular vote. You would factually, regardless of whether or not you think it's a good idea, if you're in terms of a more democratic policy outcome, abolishing the Electoral College would be factually and arguably, incontrovertibly, irrefutably more democratic than leaving it in place. Now, again, you can say that that's a bad idea if you think that the national office of the presidency shouldn't be left to a popular vote. I think you're wrong, but I could at least entertain the argument. But what's not arguable is the fact that that's a more democratic policy outcome. So I'm not exactly sure what President Obama is talking about. He's talking about intolerance. Intolerance where? Again, on Twitter? Sure. But what the Democratic Party wants is to expand health care for everybody, including conservatives, including people in West Virginia, including people in Arkansas and Alabama. It's not targeted towards progressives. We want everybody to partake in this. We want to make it easier, more convenient for people to vote, not just minorities, not just marginalized groups, but again, white rural conservative voters in West Virginia. We want them to be able to take advantage of mail-in ballots, absentee ballots, early voting, things of that nature. So where is this intolerance streak? Where I think at the end of the day, because President Obama has said something to this before, I think, like so many people, he's unfortunately confusing a very, very vocal element of the progressive activist left online with the mainstream left or the Democratic Party, where there's simply really no representation of that. Whereas on the right, their cancel culture is everywhere. It's not just with the online, right? It's not just with Ben Shapiro and Jordan Peterson and Matt Walsh and Michael Knowles, and there are millions upon millions upon millions of sycophants, Tim Pool, whatever. It's actually in the Republican Party. It's sitting members of the Republican Party. It's people who actually wield state power and people in the media. It's a bit more prominent there. So I don't like how he both sides this issue. But otherwise, really interesting interview with former President Barack Obama. Let me know what you think in the comments section.